What's development? Well, I said development is not the same as growth. It is very important to be aware of that difference. I found out what development was in the Army, actually, during World War II as a result of a very curious circumstance. I was a part of the Corps of Engineers in 10th Corps headquarters. And I was a sergeant at the time involved in engineering intelligence. So I landed on A Day on the island of Leyte in the Philippines. And my job was to find materials that could be used for building roads and other structures that we were going to need on the island. And I was traveling with an infantry unit and was into the island, reporting into headquarters every day by one of these crank phones. And one morning, after we'd been on the island about 3 months, and by that time the combat had wound down, we were involved in kind of mopping up operations. I was told to come back to headquarters. The commanding general wanted to see me, General Seibert. Now, when you're a sergeant, the commanding general wants to see you. That can only mean one thing: court-martial. So I couldn't figure out what I had done wrong that time. So I got back to headquarters, cleaned up, and went to the general's office. And I came in, he had a stack of papers in front of him. And he said, "Sergeant," he said, "I understand you were trained as an architect. Is that correct?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Where were you trained?" So I told him. He said, "Did you ever practice architecture before you got in the Army?" I said, "Yes, sir." "How long?" I told him. "Where? What kind of things did you do?" I had no idea what he was driving at. Then he said, "Did you ever do any architecture in the military?" I said, "Yes, I spent 1.5 years in the Desert Training Center." "What did you build there?" I told him what I built there. He said, "Good." He said, "I need an architect." He said, "We're winding down here now, and we have a lot of tired troops. And I want to build a recreation center to accommodate from 400 to 600 men at a time. So I can rotate through the troops on the island for periods of 2 to 4 days, where they can completely relax and have some fun." He says, "I think I have an ideal site for it, and I'd like to take you there and show it to you." So this was at Tacloban, a little town on the north east side of the island. And we walked out of the shed in which the headquarters was located down to the beach and got in a little LCI, a little infantry landing craft, and came around the head of the island. The island is kind of a kidney bean shaped island with a river running down it called the Barugo River. And we were over here. We took this little craft and came around into the mouth of the river and came down about 1.5 miles or 2, pulled ashore, and on the east side of that river was a large open field completely surrounded by forest. It was a beautiful flat site right on the edge of the river. And he showed it to me and he said, "What do you think?" I said, "It looks great. I think it's a marvelous site." He said, "Good." He said, "This is where we want to build it." And he said, "Are you interested?" I said, "Yeah, I'd love to do it. You know, anything to get out of the traveling with that infantry unit on the other end of the island." He said, "Good." He said, "Can you start tomorrow?" I said, "Sure I can, if you say so." He said, "Okay, we'll start tomorrow." I said, "Fine." I said, "Now, how many engineers are you going to give me to work with?" "Oh," he said, "Don't be silly. I can't afford any." I said, "Well, how in the world am I going to build? I can't build this thing alone." He said, "Oh, no. He said, "I'll give you enough money to hire 250 natives." I said, "But I don't even know the language." He said, "That's all right. I'll give you an interpreter." I said, "But it's going to be very difficult. How am I going to work with a group of 250 people with no knowledge of them at all, and they don't know our construction methods or anything?" He said, "I thought you said you were an architect." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, then work it out." I said, "All right, what materials are you going to give me?" "Oh," he said, "I can't afford to give you any materials." Now, I didn't quite say it, but what I meant was, how the hell do you expect me to build this thing without any materials? He said, "How do the natives build things? Go find out how they do it." Well, when I expressed some hesitancy, he asked me again if I was an architect. He said, "I thought you knew how to build buildings." Well, I didn't think it could be done, but anything to get out of what I had been doing was acceptable, so I agreed. Now, the next morning, equipped with 1 interpreter and 2 MPs, I came around the island to a little town that was right over here called Barugo, same name as the river. Through the interpreter interpreter, I asked them, I said, who are the best builders in this town? Now, the only buildings they have are shacks, up on stilts, built out of native materials. It was really primitive. And they told me there were a pair of men, brothers, who were the best builders in town. I said, where were they? They said, what do you want them for? And I told them. And they disappeared. A little while later, these two men came around and said, what do you want? I said, I want you to build me a house. I'll pay you for it. They said, what do you want a house for? And I explained that I wanted to see how they built a house. Well, they said, what are you going to do with the house when we're done building? And I said, you could keep it. So they signed on immediately. The next week, I lived with them, together with my interpreter and two MPs, and watched everything they did in building a shack. Now, they used only 3 materials. They used the trunks of coconut palms as the posts. They used bamboo for what we would call beams and girders and columns. And they used a long grass called deepa, which they wove into mats. And those were the only 3 materials they used in building a shack. And I watched this very carefully. And when they were done, I had 2 problems as far as materials were concerned. The first thing I noticed is that every shack that had been up for a while leaned. And I wanted to find out why, and they told me why. The joints, when they put 2 pieces of bamboo together, were tied by this grass. The grass expanded when it was moist. It loosened, and so things under a little wind would lean. So I decided we couldn't tolerate that in a big construction job. But we didn't have to. It turned out all over the island was signal core wire. And so we did a little experimentation using wire to make the joints, and we found out we could produce absolutely rigid joints by tying them properly. The other problem I had is I wanted to put a dock on the river from which people could dive into the river and swim. Well, that's not particularly difficult, except the river rose and fell 9 feet a day. So I needed a dock that would go up and down with the tide, with a ramp going down to it that would be pivoted. Now, the big problem is, how am I going to get a dock that will hold 200 people to float? Well, the answer to that turned out to be easy. There were 55-gallon drums all over the island. So by building a cage and incorporating them into the cage, I could float that dock. It would go up and down. All I had to do was anchor it so that it went up and down on poles, and it would move with the tide. Now, having solved those 2 problems, I went back to headquarters and spent about a week designing a facility. This was sleeping facilities, dormitories, playrooms. The big problem I ran into is that the main room had to be 40 by 60 feet, the indoor area. The outdoor stuff, baseball fields and that kind of thing, was relatively easy. But the largest piece of bamboo you can get is about 20 feet. The average is about 16. How the hell do you cover a 40-foot span with pieces of bamboo that are only this big? Well, the answer, you know, was to build a truss. So I designed bamboo trusses. And when I got all this done, we went out to the area, hired 150 men and 100 women. The men went out to cut the coconut palms and the bamboo, and the women were set up in the field to weave the mats, which were used for the wall coverings, the roof, and the other solid fillers between the structural members. And we began to build this recreation center. As we did, we developed an audience. By the time we were finished, we had an audience of 1,000 to 2,000 natives every day standing there watching. They just couldn't believe what they were seeing. Because when we built the truss, they'd never seen a truss before. And when we put the walls up for this building 40 feet apart, they were all standing there shaking their head. There was no way to put a roof on it. And when they finally saw the trusses go up on the roof and then the roofing go on top of it, they were absolutely amazed. At the end of that project, the thing, when it was open, the natives went back to their village, tore it down, and rebuilt it for what they had learned from us. All right. I learned what development meant in that experience. Why? I was more developed than they were. But what did development mean? That I had more than they had? No. Development is not a matter of how much you have. It's a matter of how much you can do with whatever you have. If I have two people with the same amount of resources, the one that can do the most with them is the more developed. If I have a person with a lot of resources who can't do anything with them, and another one with very little resources who can do a lot with them, who's the more developed? The one with fewer resources and the greater ability to use them. The paradigm of development is not John Paul Getty or Rockefeller or Morgan. It's Robinson Crusoe. Because he had nothing but his capability to use the resources that were available to him and to create a high quality of life. Or the Swiss Family Robinson. Development is the ability and desire to satisfy your own needs and desires and those of others. Development is a capacity. It is competence. Now, that means the process by which people develop is education. Development is a matter of learning, not a matter of earning. Standard of living is not an indicator of development. Quality of life is. You can have a very high standard of living and be very poorly developed, and vice versa. For example, suppose we take an Aborigine group in the wilds of Australia. Having selected them to be the beneficiaries, we load up a bunch of planes and move down there a bunch of automobiles, refrigerators, dishwashers, television sets, VCRs, and all the rest of it, and give it to the community. Have we developed them? They're not one damn bit more developed. They have a higher standard of living when we leave, but they're not more developed. On the other hand, when a Peace Corps goes into a poor community with nothing and raises the capacity of that community to serve its own purposes, a Peace Corps member is developing the community without any resources. The more developed you are, the less dependent you are on resources. The more you can create resources out of whatever you have. Now, the interesting thing about development is because it's a learning process, nobody can develop somebody else. I wish our governments around the world realized that. No government can develop its population. The only one that can develop a population is the population. Development has to be self-development.